And we're very fortunate in this case to have Mr. Meharry come from the 10th Amendment Center to address this. He is the National Communications Director for the 10th Amendment Center. He's written a number of books. He actually has a very wide pedigree here. He writes with the Shift Gold blog, the Friday Gold Wrap. He's written 3 books, the most recent of which is on sale, I believe, in the back, is the, Nullification Objection, Dismantling the Opposition. And we're running a little long, so I'll be brief, but it is distinctly my honor to introduce Mr. Michael Meharry from the 10th Amendment Center.
Well, thank you guys very much for having me. I appreciate it. I want to thank Representative Becker for inviting me to his committee. He's doing something that's very, very unique with this committee. I don't know of any other state legislature in the country that is digging into these issues of federalism and really providing an opportunity to educate the representatives. It's really a neat thing, and he deserves a great deal of credit for doing that. So I just want to thank him. And again, thank you guys all for coming out. I know that, we're in the middle of a snowstorm apparently. So, I'm braving the weather. Good job. So I'm the National Communications Director for the 10th Amendment Center, as Joe said. And we kind of sum up what we do with one very simple phrase: follow the Constitution, every issue, every time, no exceptions, no excuses. That's what we're all about. And we do a lot of education, things like this, where we talk about constitutional issues and look at them in an originalist context, original meaning as it was understood at the time of ratification. And then we also do a lot of political activism, and this involves using state and even local power to undermine overreaching federal authority. Representative Becker mentioned this idea of nullification, and that's really the principle that we use. I'm not going to get into that tonight because we're here to talk about the Electoral College. But I do have my book that somebody was fortunate to win, but Our Last Hope goes into this principle of nullification, what it means and how it can be practically applied. If that's a subject you're interested in, I do have a few of these in the back, and it helps feed my wife and kids, so that's always a good thing. But like I said, we're here to talk about the Electoral College, and I don't really know how to make, oh, look, there's a title. Oh, cool. Okay, a couple of things. The first thing is, this is the first time I've done a full presentation on the Electoral College, so you all are like guinea pigs, so if it's really, really bad, I apologize, but it won't be. And second, I don't usually use a PowerPoint, so I have no idea what I'm doing with this thing. So the PowerPoint's not that particularly important, so that's a good thing. So we're going to talk about the Electoral College tonight, and as I was getting into this, we're going to look at a couple of things. We're going to first off talk about what this thing is, because I really think that a lot of people don't know.
Next slide, previous slide.
Okay, let's see, let's play. Ooh, there, that's us. All right, so like I said, as I was starting to kind of outline this, I realized that really before we do anything, we need to kind of just go over what the Electoral College is, because I think we all just kind of take it for granted. We see the election returns come in and we see these electoral votes and it's this thing that happens, but what is it really? So I just want to take a few minutes and just give a real quick overview of what the Electoral College actually is. So it's interesting because when you really think about it, when you go to the polls to elect a president, you're not really voting for a president. Technically, you're voting for a slate of electors. And those electors are the ones who will ultimately choose the president. Now, this was set up in the Constitution, and we're going to get into why and how as we get through this presentation. But the Electoral College, it consists of, there we go. It consists of 538 electors, and these are divided up based on the census and apportionment, just like your representatives are. So the Electoral College, the number of electoral votes that your state has is equal to the number of people that you have in Congress. So that would be your state representatives and your 2 senators. So every state is guaranteed to have at least 3 electors, because every state has 2 senators and at least 1 representative. In the state of Kentucky, where I live, we have 6 congressmen and 2 senators, so we have 8 electoral votes. Obviously, it's somewhat proportional to population, but it's a little bit different than population, as we'll see as we go through this. So it takes 270 electoral votes to have the majority to become the president. When the Electoral College was originally created, they actually did it where the person with the top number of votes was the president, and the person with the second most votes became the vice president, which created a weird situation where you could have people of opposing parties serving at the same time. For instance, in the Adams administration, Thomas Jefferson was the president, and they were definitely at odds. So the 12th Amendment was ratified in the early 1800s, and that kind of changed the way they did the Electoral College to the way we have it today, where you have a president and a vice president that are kind of voted on together, and it's more of a party-oriented process. But like I said, you're actually voting for this slate of electors. So most states have what we call a winner-takes-all system. So if your state votes for candidate A, then candidate A gets all of your electoral votes in the Electoral College. There are two states that actually have a proportional way that they do it, and to refer to my notes here to keep turning over. Nebraska and Maine have a variation of proportional representation. These states allocate 2 electoral votes to the state vote winner, and then they have 1 electoral vote to the popular vote winner in each congressional district. So you could have, like for instance, in Kentucky, we had 2 districts that went to Hillary Clinton, and then the other 4 were Donald Trump. So if we were Maine or Nebraska, then we'd have a proportion divided up. But there's only 2 states to do that. Everybody else is winner take all. So where do these electors come from? Who the heck are they? And this was something I didn't have any idea. They're actually chosen by the political parties. And there are a couple different ways that they do it. A lot of states just have an election for electors during their state convention. So you have your state Republican convention, they'll select their electors, and then the Democrats would do the same thing. There are a few states that actually have like their party central committee chooses and votes on the electors. So what you're getting when you vote is you're getting, if your Republican wins, and you get the Republican slate of electors, and if the Democrat wins, the Democrat electors go. Now, it is interesting, there is such a thing as a faithless elector. And some states actually will allow their electors to have discretion. Other states won't. Most of the states actually bind their electors to vote for the winner. But in this last election, there were actually 10 faithless electors. And interestingly, you would think in the political climate that most of those would have been people that were supposed to vote for Trump that didn't. It was actually the other way around. There were 5 people that voted that were Hillary Clinton delegates and ended up voting for somebody else. And there were 5 that voted for Clinton, or that were supposed to vote for Trump that didn't, but 3 of those were tossed out by the states as invalid. So there's actually 3 votes that would have gone to Trump that went to somebody else. If you're curious as to who these people are, I will tell you. We had 3 votes for Colin Powell. We had John Kasich, Ron Paul, and Bernie Sanders. And Faith Spotted Eagle, I don't know who that is, they all received 1 vote. So in overall, Clinton actually lost 5 votes and Trump lost 3. So you can have faithless electors. Kind of an interesting thing I didn't know. So there's this movement now that was just mentioned to have a popular vote. And this comes up quite frequently. And of course, it came up big during the aftermath of the last election because Trump won the Electoral College, but he did not win the popular vote. So now we've got everybody on the left wants to have a popular vote because they think next time around they won't end up with a Trump. Maybe, maybe not. Colorado, as was just mentioned, just actually held an election, or a legislative bill, one election was a bill that went through their state legislature that was passed. And under this system, the delegates, the electors for Colorado will now vote for, well, let me back up a second. The movement is to create a compact of states. And once they get enough states to create a majority of the electors, what they're going to do is they're going to make it so that all of their electors have to vote for the people who got the popular vote. So this is basically a way to do an end around the intended structure of the Electoral College. So to put it in practical terms, in Colorado, let's say that in the last election, Colorado went Clinton, which I believe is the case. But let's say that it had gone Trump. Under this scheme, even if the majority of people in the state had voted for Donald Trump, the electors would have gone to Hillary Clinton because she got the biggest popular vote. So in essence, what you're doing is you're undermining the will of the people of the state of Colorado. This is significant, and that's one of the major themes that I'm going to cover on as we talk about this issue of the Electoral College. So currently 11 states plus Washington, D.C. Incidentally, Washington, D.C. has 3 electors, even though they're not really a state. But 11 states plus the District of Columbia have signed this onto this compact, and Colorado and its 9 electoral votes will join after this most recent election. And that will bring the total number of signatories to this compact to 13. And the electoral vote count is at 181. They need 270. So we're getting close to the point that we're going to have, in effect, a popular election for the President of the United States. So what does that mean? Why does it matter? Well, there's 3 reasons that I can pinpoint that this is going on. Number 1 is politics. Number 2 is politics. Number 3 is politics. It's all about politics. Like I said, it is the left right now that is pushing for this because they believe that they can get a probably permanent advantage in an election by it being popular vote. They have a lot of people. There are a lot of progressives in this country. The fact of the matter is, though, they're concentrated in relatively small areas. So California, New York, Connecticut, big cities. If you look at Kentucky, it's interesting. Kentucky was almost completely Trump, except for Fayette County, which is Lexington, and Jefferson County, which is Louisville. So you get these urban areas where you tend to get more progressive voters. So the people that are progressive realize that if they can change the system so that it's based on just total number of votes instead of total number of states, then it gives them an advantage. It's all about politics. So here's the question, though. So what? What's the problem? What's the big deal? I think I have a slide for this, if I remember correctly. Oops. No, I don't. Anyway, all right. What's the problem? Why does this matter? Why are we even talking about this? So what? The argument that you're going to get from people who support this idea is that it's more democratic. That's the philosophical reason. It's more democratic. I mean, after all, the person that gets the most votes should be the president. And at some level, that's plausible. The problem is, and this is what we're going to talk about because this is fundamental. The problem with this is the United States is not one nation. It is not the United States of America. It's not one big giant glob. It is a union of sovereign states. It is a union of independent states. And this is a very important distinction and something that the founding generation insisted on. In fact, when you go back to the ratification debates, one of the biggest fears that people had at that time was that there would be an overriding central government that would erase the state borders and trample on the various political societies. If you take nothing else away from tonight, I want you to remember this one thing. The state, the people of each state are the primary political society in the American system. It is not one nation indivisible, despite what we said during the Pledge of Allegiance. It is a union of republics. Now, each of these states delegated powers to the federal government to do certain things, primarily national defense, foreign relations, some things regulating trade, but for the most part, most of the power was intended to be at the state and local level. This is indisputable. James Madison said in Federalist 45 that the powers delegated to the federal government are few and defined. Those which remain with the states and the people are numerous and indefinite. There's absolutely no debate that that was the system we were supposed to have. But sadly, we are evolving towards the flip of that, where the federal government has virtually all of the power and we're erasing the borders of the state. I believe this is an extreme problem because, as I said during Representative Becker's committee hearing yesterday, I believe that the biggest threat to our liberty is centralized power. When you start monopolizing power at the top, and everything is decided by a handful of people, that's when you're going to have your rights most trampled on. We all know that all levels of government have corruption and potential to abuse your rights. But when you have a decentralized system, when you have 50 states, then you have some competition, you have some checks and balances, and ultimately you have someplace else you can go if things get really bad in your state. When you have centralized power, there's no place to go, and you've got people in Washington, D.C. making decisions such as how much water you can have in your toilet, which I think is absurd. I don't think Washington, D.C. needs to tell me how much water I can have in my toilet. But this whole movement for a national electoral vote is part of this movement towards centralizing authority and creating this one giant glob instead of an independent republic of states. So I'm going to go over just real quick a few things that will demonstrate that what I'm talking about is true, because we are pounded into our head from the time we're in kindergarten that it's one nation, and that's what you hear from the national vote people. It's one nation. We're the leader of our nation. No, that's not what this is. So Black's Law Dictionary, which is a primary legal dictionary. It's how lawyers will look up words. I believe I have this up here. Black's Law Dictionary. I'm going to read this to you because this is important. It tells you the difference. A national government is a government of the people by a single state or nation, united as a community by what is termed the social compact, and is possessing complete and perfect supremacy over persons and things so far as they can be made the lawful objects of civil government. A federal government, which is what we have in the United States ostensibly, is distinguished from a national government by its being a government of a community of independent and sovereign states united by a compact. Okay? So France is a singular nation. Paris has complete control over everything in France. We're not France. We have each independent state, and the state legislature here in Ohio, again, theoretically, should be controlling things like healthcare and workplace safety and environmental regulations, and you can go down the list. Most of these things were not meant to be handled at the federal level. It's interesting, I always like to quote Alexander Hamilton, because Alexander Hamilton was the founding father, I think, that was most fond of national power. He wanted a national government. In fact, during the Philadelphia Convention, he actually proposed that we should have a president for life. Like, he was into the whole monarchy thing. So whenever you can quote Hamilton as being a limited government guy, I think there's some significance in what he's saying. In Federalist 32, Hamilton hit this same idea. He said, an entire consolidation of the states into one complete national sovereignty would imply an entire subordination of the parts, and whatever powers might remain in them would be altogether dependent on the general will. The general will. So that's the idea of a national election, right? It's the general will, not the will of each independent state. He says, but the plan of the convention aims only at a partial union or consolidation. The state governments would clearly retain all the rights of sovereignty which they before had, and which were not, by that act, exclusively delegated to the United States. So again, this key distinction between a national government and a federal government. People think federal government, think Washington, D.C., but when I say federal government, I mean the idea that the power is dispersed between the general government, the national government, and the governments of the various states. One more point to drive this home. James Madison, who many people call the father of the Constitution, talked about this idea of who was it that ultimately has the authority in the American system. Now, if you look at the Constitution, you'll see at the very top, it says, we the people, right? So this is the idea that we are sovereign. The people are sovereign. Not the government, not the president, the people. It was interesting because if you look at the British system, the British actually believed that Parliament was sovereign. Parliament was the ultimate authority. Parliament could do whatever it wanted to do. Their constitution could be changed by an act of Parliament because Parliament was sovereign. Supposedly, you're not supposed to be able to do that in the United States. The Congress can't change the Constitution. It requires an act of the people through the ratification process. Again, we have a Congress now that thinks it can change the Constitution at a whim, and that's a problem, but not a problem for today. But this idea of we the people, there is a raging debate between people who believe that it was we the people as the whole America or we the people of the states. And the evidence is overwhelming that it meant we the people of the states. It was interesting during the committee hearing yesterday, there was one representative that kind of kept snickering at this idea of a compact. And I know for a fact where he was coming from. He was coming from this idea of one people ratified the Constitution. And he kept snickering at me, but he was wrong, which was a little bit annoying, but I was being polite. The fact of the matter is, when it says we the people, it really meant we the people of the states. And if you look at the original draft, it said we the people of, and it listed each state. Now, why did they change it? Well, for one thing, it was kind of unwieldy to list all of those states, but more significantly, at the time, they didn't know which states would ratify. There was no guarantee that all of the states were going to join the Union. And in fact, as Representative Becker mentioned, North Carolina and Rhode Island remained outside of the Union for quite some time and operated as independent sovereign nations during that time. They didn't have any representation in Congress. They were independent until they ratified the Constitution. And that's kind of the proof in the pudding that this was an act of the people of the states. Because if it was an act of the whole general population, well, by the time North Carolina and Rhode Island were still out, obviously a majority of America had ratified the Constitution. Under this one people theory, Rhode Island and North Carolina would have been forced into the Union, and they weren't. But this is what Madison said, and he actually explained this. This is in a document called the Report of 1800, and it was written, and it doesn't even matter. We don't need to go into that. It's not important. But this is what Madison said about this idea of who the people are. He said, the states are parties to the Constitution or the Compact. This is in the judgment of the committee equally free from objection. So he's talking about these, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798. I guess it is important for me to say this because it doesn't make sense out of context. The Report of 1800 was a response to objections to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which were documents that outlined this principle of nullification. And in simplest terms, nullification is the idea that the states created the federal government, and that as the federal government's creator, that in the last resort, the states have the authority to determine what is or is not constitutional. So the Report of 1800 was further defending this idea. And Madison went right after this idea of one people to show that ultimately the states are the supreme sovereign political society in the American system. So that's what he's talking about when he says that this is free from objection. He says, it is indeed true that the term states is sometimes used in a vague sense. Did I change I didn't. Here, wait, I have this up so you can look at it. Oops, I skipped Federalist 68. There we go. The other position involved in the branch of the resolutions, namely that the states are parties to the Constitution or Compact, he said, is in judgment of the committee equally free from objection, right? It is indeed true that the term states is sometimes used in a vague sense and sometimes in different senses according to the subject to which it's applied. Thus, it sometimes means the separate sections of territory occupied by the political societies within each. So Ohio is a state. It's a geographical region. Sometimes the particular government's established by these societies. So you could say the state is all of the folks that are in Columbus. He says sometimes it's those societies is organized into these particular governments. And lastly, it means the people composing these political society in their highest sovereign capacity. Although it might be wished that the perfection of language admitted less diversity in the signification of the same words, yet little inconveniency is produced by it, where the true sense can be collected with certainty from the different applications. In the present instance, whatever different constructions of the term states in the resolutions may have been entertained, all will at least concur that the last mentioned, because in the sense the Constitution was submitted by the states, In that sense, the states ratified it. And in that sense of the term states, they are consequently parties to the compact from which the powers of the federal government result. So states are the people of the states, which are the sovereign units of society. So the people of Ohio, the people of Kentucky, the people of Virginia, the people of California, those are sovereign, individual, political entities, and they have agreed to come together to form a union, and that union's important, and we value that union because it provides us with defense, it provides us with unity, it provides us a way to face the world in a unified way. But it was never intended to erase the states. It was never intended to make it so the federal government could determine how much water is in your toilet. So this is where the system has gone off the rails. And this is why it's so important to grasp this, and why I've spent so much time when I'm supposed to be talking about the Electoral College talking about this distinction. Because the problem with what we're seeing with the Electoral College right now is that it is another step towards erasing the sovereignty of the states. If the sovereign people of the states are independent, then it is absurd for the state of Colorado to usurp those people's authority and hand their electoral votes to somebody that that state did not approve of. It's as simple as that. And to me, we can talk about the pragmatics, and we can talk about the reasons that we don't want this to happen. But when it comes down to it, to me, the most important thing is that it undermines the constitutional system. We've undermined the constitutional system enough, and it needs to stop. So, now the interesting thing about this is that we've actually had this debate before. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time explaining how we ended up with this Electoral College system, because this was actually a hotly debated topic during the Philadelphia Convention when they got together to draft the Constitution. Now, we don't know a whole lot about what happened at the Philadelphia Convention because mostly it was held behind closed doors and there were no reporters and it was pretty secret. But Madison took some notes, and there were a couple other folks there that took some notes. So we have some idea of the various things that were debated. And we know a little bit about the debate on how the president was going to be selected. And Edmund Randolph, who was friends with James Madison, both of them for Virginia, they introduced what was known as the Virginia Plan. It was one of the first formal plans for a new government. And it was one of the things that they kind of worked off of to eventually create the Constitution. In the Virginia Plan, it called for Congress to select the president. But a prominent Pennsylvania delegate, James Wilson, favored an appointment by the people. Now, what does that mean? It means popular election, right? Wilson believed that selecting the president through a popular vote that included all of the eligible voters in the state would make the president and Congress as independent as possible of each other as well as of the states. So the first debate was, do we want Congress to appoint a president, or do we want the people to be involved in it? I can certainly see the problem with having Congress do it, because those two branches are working. That's a little bit too close for comfort, and a lot of the delegates agreed. So there was this idea for a popular vote. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, he suggested that the governors of each state should select the president. So there were three plans at the initial onset of trying to cobble together what was going to become the Constitution. Now, Randolph, who you remember is for the congressional appointment, he vocally opposed the idea of the governors doing it. He said the governors would lack knowledge necessary to select a president because they would be unaware of characters not within their own small spheres. Now, remember, this was before the days of the internet, right? So if I'm in Massachusetts, I'm not likely to know a whole lot about somebody down in South Carolina. So this was a big issue at that time about information. What do we know about these folks? So the delegation quickly dispatched of this idea, and 9 states ultimately voted against having the governors select the president. So that was done. So now we're back to Congress or a popular vote. Now, in the summer of 1887, everybody was kind of leaning toward the Congress thing. There was the popular vote just wasn't kind of catching, what's the word I'm looking for? Wasn't all that popular, but it was still out there. So once they finally determined what the powers of the president were going to be, they came back to, in the summer of 1787, they came back to the discussion on how are we going to select this president. Now, at this point, New York's Gouverneur Morris, he's sometimes called the penman of the Constitution because he actually wrote the preamble. And he vehemently opposed the idea of a congressional appointment. He argued that there needed to be a clear separation between the legislative and executive branches. I think he was wise in that. He said congressional selection would make the president, quote, the mere creature of the legislature if appointed and impeachable by that body. He supported Wilson's call for a popular vote. So the popular vote, all of a sudden, oh, well, maybe we'll consider this again. He said the president ought to be elected by the people at large, by the freeholders of the country. But there was some opposition to this as well. And there's some very good reasons that were brought up in the Philadelphia Convention to oppose the popular vote. I think the most forceful was brought up by Charles Pinckney, who was in South Carolina. And he warned that popular election would, quote, be led by a few active and designing men. He feared that, quote, the most populous states, by combining in favor of the same individual, will be able to carry their points. So Pinckney's concern was that if we do popular election, these guys would be able to go to Pennsylvania and Virginia and maybe Massachusetts, where there was a lot of population, just work those states, get enough votes, and smaller states like Maryland or South Carolina would be completely locked, or certainly Georgia, would be completely locked out of selecting a president. So I'm going to show you a couple of slides here, if I can make this work right. So this is the, look, I have a pointer. So this is the vote by county from the last election. And you'll notice that the vast majority of the country voted for Trump. See all the red. And then you'll notice where the concentrations of Hillary Clinton voters were, like Miami, urban area, Tampa, urban area. You've got California, you've got New York, Connecticut, all of these more left-leaning states. But you know, even in a state like Maine, you have a good swath of red. Now, it's interesting because you'll notice that a lot of this is rural versus urban. That's significant, I think. So this is kind of looking at the map in a different way. This is how the vote, each of these blocks, this little block right here, that space represents 1 million people. So you can see kind of how the states and the populations voted and what's blue and what's red. This is what it would look like if we did popular vote. Basically, you'd have 4 states that controlled the country: New York, Florida, Texas, and California. If you lived in Arizona or Missouri or poor little Tennessee down here, you wouldn't get to have much influence at all. You guys got a little bit. No, that's Oklahoma. Where's Ohio? Oh, there you are. Yeah, see, you guys have a little bit of influence. So, maybe not so bad for you guys. Illinois would have a good bit of thing. But it completely changes the way that the votes would be counted. So you can see that, shows the power of your vote in your state if there was no electoral college. So Virginia's George Mason also opposed the idea of popular vote. He did for a different reason. He raised concerns about the popular vote, arguing that it would be an unnatural, he said it would be as unnatural, he's away with words, as unnatural to refer the choice of a proper character for chief magistrate to the people as it would be to refer a trial of colors to a blind man. So he was basically saying that people aren't going to know enough about these guys to cast an educated vote. Now, this is the one, like if you listen to progressives who are arguing for popular vote, this is the one they'll bring up. They pretend like Mason's was the main concern. I think Pinckney's was the main concern, but they'll pretend like Mason. They'll say, well, we have the internet now, so we can be educated. If you've ever talked to your average person, you realize that that's not necessarily true. But that's neither here nor there. He also said the extent of the country renders it impossible that the people can have the requisite capacity to judge of the respective pretensions of the candidates. Again, I will accept the argument that maybe Mason's argument is a little bit outdated, but I think the primary argument And I think Pinckney's argument was the primary argument, was this idea that it would create too much power in urban areas, in cities, and in the states. So at this point, it was kind of up in the air. They pitched the whole thing to what was known as the Committee of 11. So there was one delegate from each state. They went in the back room and they met for several months, and they eventually came out. There was a number of things that this committee handled, but eventually they came out of the meetings, and this was in the fall of 1787, with an electoral college. So they basically said, these two plans that we've got here, congressional appointment and popular vote, not going to work. We're going to come up with something completely different. So they came up with the Electoral College. And it was pretty much the scheme that we have today, with the exception of what I told you already, that the first place person would be the president, the second place would be the vice president. It's interesting. Initially, when they brought the plan out, they wanted the Senate to have the tie break. As it turns out, the House of Representatives has the tie break. I'm going to get to something important in that in just one second. Now, Gouverneur Morris was the primary spokesperson for this plan. He said that it would eliminate the danger of intrigue and faction if the appointment should be made by the legislature. So he said it takes care of this whole problem of Congress and, being too close to the president, gets rid of that. And then Wilson, James Wilson from Pennsylvania, he abandoned the plan of popular vote and threw his support behind the Electoral College. Now, there was a lot of concern about the Senate having the power of the tie break, because the Senate is also the body that tries an impeachment. So again, they felt like maybe there was a little bit too much, too close there. So maybe it would be better to pitch it to the House. And that's ultimately what happened. The House breaks it, but it's interesting. They don't break it by a majority vote of the House. And a lot of people don't know this. If it is a tie, they actually break it by state delegation. So each state gets a vote, just like in the Electoral College. So you see this whole, through this whole process, you see this commitment to the sovereignty of the states, not just this big kind of democratic, big blob thing that we have going on. And he said that it would be the state ballot. When they were arguing for the House to do it, he said that it should be by state vote and not by individual member, because as Sherman said, quote, large states would have so great an advantage if the decision was made by a simple majority vote. So we see, even in the structure of the Electoral College, this protection from what essentially was mob rule in a pure democracy. And that's a unique thing about the American system. It is democratic in the sense that we, the people, have input into it, but it is really a republic, as was mentioned. And there are checks on democracy to ensure that we don't end up with mob rule. So that's the plan that we got out of the Electoral College. So you can see we had this debate about popular vote, and popular vote was rejected. And I think it was rejected for good reasons, and I think you will probably agree with me that those reasons, particularly the fear of making New York, Florida, Texas, and California the primary, where controlling the country, that's not such a good idea. When we had the ratifying debates, and as I mentioned, I believe the ratifying debates are where we find the meaning of the Constitution. I think I mentioned this actually at dinner, so I didn't mention it to you guys, sorry. So I'll mention it now. I believe that we find the meaning of the Constitution in the ratifying debates. That was the point where the people that supported the Constitution said, this is what it's going to do, this is what it's not going to do. And the people that opposed the Constitution said, oh, no, we're afraid this is going to happen. And the people that supported it said, no, that's not going to happen. And the promises and the words of the supporters of the Constitution are what swung people over to vote to ratify the Constitution. So that's where we find the meaning. We need to look at the ratifying conventions. During the ratifying conventions, there was very little debate about the Electoral College. It was widely accepted. Alexander Hamilton said that he would hesitate not to affirm that if the manner of it be not perfect, it is least excellent. He said it unites in an eminent degree all the advantages the union of which was to be wished for. So There wasn't really a whole lot of controversy about it in the ratification, which indicates to me that it must have been a pretty good plan, because if you look at the ratification debates, they fought about almost everything. So it's interesting that this was widely accepted. So what are the practical effects of changing the system to a popular vote? Claim it will end this idea of battleground states. We have battleground states today. I think Ohio's typically considered a battleground state. Florida, Pennsylvania, sometimes Michigan. Now, why are these states battleground states? These states are battleground states because they have a roughly equally divided electorate. Like, I lived in Florida for a long time, and it can swing either way. You've got a lot of progressives and you've got a lot of conservatives, and that's why it's a battleground state, because it can go either way. Kentucky, not a battleground state. It's going red, I'm telling you right now. That's just the way it is. It's a very conservative state, other than my town of Lexington. So this idea that it's going to just get rid of battleground states is silly. It's just going to change the battleground states to the ones that we saw back there. Instead of being in Ohio, it'll be California. And what's the battle, right? So it will change that whole structure. Problem number 2, urban interests will dominate. We are primarily an urban country now. As you could see from the map, the Electoral College gives some weight to folks who live in rural areas. And I think that's important because there are differences. And I think it's important to understand there are differences in states. We want to look at the country as this one big nation. And yet, if you go to California, I go to California pretty often, it's different. Kind of weird. Kentucky's different from Ohio. Alaska's different from Florida. Not just in climate, but in political society and views and culture. It's different. And so those differences should be represented and not just as one big mass. And finally, the other problem is it will change the way campaigns are run. People think it's going to, it'll be just the same, and they think that Hillary would have won if we had popular vote. It's not necessarily true. I want to give you an analogy real quick, and I'm about to wrap up. Imagine the World Series, okay? The World Series, you have to win 7 games, right? That's the way you play the World Series. Or you don't have to win 7 games, you have to win 4 out of 7. Got a little confused there for a second. It's been a long week. You have to win 4 games, right? Now imagine if the rule was not that you had to win 4 games, but whoever had the most points at the end of the 7 games, they got to be the winner. It would completely change the way the game was played, because as it is, if you're up, say, 4-2 in a game, and you're pretty sure you're in late innings, you're pretty sure that you can bring in your reliever, you can lock it down. That's how you're going to play it. But if you're having to score as many points as possible, then it's going to become a completely offensive game. My point being that if you change the way the game is played, it's going to change the way the game is played. And people will just campaign differently. The strategies will be different. It's not that it's going to be the same as it is now, so it's going to be different. And I would propose to our progressive friends who think this is such a great idea that their state may not always vote for the people that they think they're going to vote for. And this is the problem when you start tinkering with the system. You have to remember, a friend of mine told me this once. He said, when you think of power, when you think of giving somebody power, you should always ask yourself the question, would I want my ex-wife to have this power? Or my ex-husband, depending on your point of view. But the point being is that at some point, your opponent is going to have this power too. People in Colorado are going to be angry as fire when their state votes for a Republican, and all of a sudden, when the national vote goes Republican and they went Democrat, and they're going to have to hand all of their votes to the Republican. But, that's what they're looking for. So, to win the presidency, the architect of the Electoral College expected a candidate to win broad multi-regional coalitions. The last thing they desired was to permit a few huge cities from dominating presidential races. That's the main takeaway that you need to take with this Electoral College thing. It's changing fundamentally the American system, and that's why I oppose this whole thing. So one more thing I want to address real quick. You're going to hear this argument that the Electoral College had to do with slavery. I'm going to tell you right now that that is absolutely, unequivocally, completely made up. They pulled this out of thin air. There is absolutely no evidence from the drafting of the Constitution, from the ratification debates, that this ever had thing one to do with slavery. It's honestly, I've read some of these articles. It's almost like I don't know, it's just the weirdest thing. I guess that's what happens when everything becomes about race and gender and identity politics. But if somebody tells you that, you can just look at them and say, oh, well, would you like to show me where they talked about this? Because even, first off, if you notice that Morris, a big proponent of the Electoral College, was from New York, and he was a delegate from Pennsylvania. Last time I checked, that's not in the South. He actually called slavery a nefarious institution. He said it was the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. So this is a supporter of the Electoral College. Also, we had Roger Sherman, who was a big proponent of the Electoral College. He was from Connecticut. Also, last time I checked, not in the South. And then, of course, there was Pinckney, and he was from the South. But the reasons that he gave had absolutely nothing to do with slavery, nothing to do with apportionment. So when people tell you that, you can just roll your eyes at them. They're being stupid. It's not true. So there you go. So that is pretty much my brief covering of the Electoral College. I appreciate all this, and where are we on time? I guess we're technically done, or do we have time for questions?
We've got some time for a few questions,
cool,
maybe 15 minutes or so. Who's got a question for Mike? Right back here.
You mentioned about Colorado and the fact that they would be giving up all of their electoral votes to the national winner. In the state of Maine, they break down the electoral votes. Is there any sort of a movement whereby each state would apportion its electoral votes based on the popular vote in that state and cast it that way, which is also fearful for me because it gets closer to a national vote?
Right. I've not seen any movement for that. And I think I don't know if I was clear on this. The Constitution is silent on how the electors are selected. It actually says that it's up to the state legislatures. So that was maybe a little mistake on their part in not making this clear. So these states do have the constitutional authority to decide how to delegate their electors and how to choose their electors. Now, I would suggest, and we talked about this at dinner with a couple of folks, that there may be a case that you could make that they are actually usurping the purpose of the Electoral College by doing this, and there may be some legal remedy, although I don't have a whole lot of faith in the federal court system to fix something like that. But that may be an option. But to answer your question, I've not seen any widespread movement to do that. I think the drive is to just do the pure popular vote.
Who else has a question? We've got a question online in the back. Do we have a question in the back? We do. Who else has a question? Right here.
My name is Barbara. And when we talk about the states that have larger populations, isn't that the issue where we have these illegals crossing and there are people out there letting them vote?
Yeah, I think
so
that's
this
also.
This is the biggest danger we have right here.
Well, I think that is. I think that certainly is a problem. And if you looked at the blue, you see those areas by the border. So yeah, but that's not really relevant to the Electoral College. But you're right, and that's another reason. Well, I mean that requires election reform. But yeah.
Okay,
you're absolutely right.
Question in the back.
Okay, we have a question. Is anyone challenging the National Popular Vote activists to public debates? And is there an organization, this is an interesting take on it, is there an organization that is pro-Electoral College somewhere, not only promoting the Electoral College, but keeping an eye on the content of high school textbooks?
If anybody's interested in starting an organization, that's a really good idea. I don't know of any. And I think, honestly, I think some of this is kind of how it happened under the radar. I hadn't really, I mean, we have very limited resources at the 10th Amendment Center. We have certain issues that we focus on, and I hadn't really dug into the Electoral College issue myself that deeply until I was invited to do this speech. I mean, I was looking at it more from the constitutional perspective, but as far as the political perspective, I hadn't thought a whole lot about it. So, yeah, somebody needs to do that.
Question
I'll
right
hire
here.
you.
My name is Mel. It seems to me as though if I understand what Colorado is trying to do there, they're not silencing the people, but they're erasing their voice after the fact.
I think that's a good way to put it. And it's weird to me because, ostensibly people in Colorado think this is a good idea. And like I said, they think it's a good idea now because it's politically viable for them. They're not going to think it's a good idea down the road when things flip. And like I said, when you start dealing with power, things always flip. But I think it's a really good way to put it. They're silencing them after the fact.
Other questions right here.
Well, the phrase came to my mind thinking about the Electoral College, don't mess with Mother Nature.
Yeah.
And I'm saying don't mess with the founding fathers who were enlightened, I believe. And they understood human nature. And also, another great hero in my book anyway is de Tocqueville.
Mm-hmm.
And he warned against tyranny of the majority.
Yep.
And that's the purpose of the Electoral College.
Yep.
And we shouldn't mess with that.
Yep. Very well
That's
said.
what I had to say. You agree with me?
I absolutely do. I like that. I like that analogy. Don't mess with Mother Nature.
Thank you, Rose.
My name is Georgia. My memory in civics class is that the Electoral College could be called into play when there were 3 or more candidates and 3 or more parties. And this was very important, as I recall. We don't have 3 or 4 parties now. It's 2-party, but if we ever get dark horses in there, that's where it comes into play, because they can decide. I think each state has the ability for their electoral votes to change after so many votes.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Yeah. Very good point.
Question right here.
My name is Bob. When somebody's elected to the Electoral College, does that change at every election?
Yes, I believe so. Like I said, those electors, the electors are chosen by the party leadership, and I believe that switches at every election. So usually, like at the Republican Party Convention of Ohio, and I'm not sure how they do it in Ohio, but if it is by convention, so the state convention before the election, they'll actually select those electors by vote. Or like I said, in some states, they do it with their party leadership or their party committees. But it's totally within each party making that decision.
Question right here.
My name is Pete. I just heard recently on the news that up in Washington, D.C., I don't know whether it was the House or the Senate, was looking at the gerrymandering that takes place in all the states right now, trying to shift around and get in everything. And one of the solutions that they are now purporting to solve all the problems is to have the federal government run the elections, not the states. I don't know. I mean, this was on the news. I mean, it was a serious
I believe
proposal.
you. My frown, I haven't heard that, but my frown was, it would totally not surprise me, because here's how government works. Government breaks something, and then they come along and tell you how they're going to fix it. That's what that sounds like to me. Because obviously the gerrymandering is a huge problem, but I don't have any faith in Washington, D.C. to fix it.
We have a question back here.
Yes, I'd like to know if the electors, and we have seen it happen in a few occasions, when they don't vote for the way they're supposed to vote, that they have been, elected to do, is there a penalty for them?
I believe that's determined by state, but fun fact, I know one of the unfaithful electors from this last election. His name's William, I can't remember. William Green. He voted for Ron Paul. He's from Texas, and he was fined for being an unfaithful elector.
Question right here.
Actually, it's more of a statement. It's kind of scary. We have to be able to teach people like you're doing. So I appreciate your being here. What I hear now is fair. Everything has to be fair. So let's have a popular vote to make it fair. And also speaking with some young people that everyone's an American. Everyone from Colombia or Mexico, we're all Americans and they don't distinguish USA. So all that plays into what you're talking about. And we need people like you coming out and explaining too. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome. And to your all's credit for being here and learning, you have the opportunity to tell people in your circles and to spread that knowledge. So everybody, education is so key, and you're absolutely right. There's a lot of dumbness, for lack of a better word. And, you know, I blame part of it is the education system, because we're not taught civics. Well, I'm sure that you got a much better civics education than I did, and my kids got virtually nothing. So we need this kind of teaching. So
We've got one last question.
This has been wonderful, but I was wondering, are you going and speaking in high schools and places where the young people need to hear this?
I'll speak wherever anybody will invite me to speak. And unfortunately, when you have government-run schools, you have people that want you to toe the government line. So it's a struggle. But if anybody has opportunities to get me into places to speak, I'll go anywhere.
Last question right back there. This is the last question.
Okay, I want to answer this one so that all of the online viewers can hear the answer. The question is, will this video be available to pass on to others? The answer is, it is being recorded. It will possibly be posted tomorrow, probably no later than Monday, at empoweru, the letter U, ohio.org. Thanks.
Well, let me just say thank you to y'all for being here, for having me.
Let's thank our great speaker tonight, Mike. It was so good having you, Mike. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed it.